This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. If you want to build a deck with a bunch of artifact creatures in it, you can find them all over at cardkingdom.com. Hello everyone, I'm Nitahone, and it is Friday, so that means it's time for another MTG Top 10. For this week's video, I ran a poll between Artifact Creatures in First Strike and Artifact Creatures 1. Not to worry, if you're eager to see First Strike, it will be next week's video. Anyway, in this video, we're going to be looking at the 10 artifact creatures in Magic's history that have left the biggest impact on the game. To qualify for this list, a card had to either be an artifact creature or be a card that makes artifact creature tokens. There were around 700 cards that qualified for this list. Before we get started, a quick reminder on how I score these lists. Pro Tour top 8s as well as Vintage and Legacy Championship top 8s are worth 2 points and Grand Prix top 8s are worth 1 point. At number 10, we have the only card on this list that is not modern legal, and that is Masticore. By today's standards, Masticore would not be all that great. A 4-mana 4/4 that makes you lose a card in your hand every turn, even if it can do damage to creatures and regenerate, is a pretty steep cost, though there may be some fun discard synergies you could play with. In its day, though, Masticore was an excellent creature. 4 for a 4/4 was really good stats, so coming with the good activated abilities was enough to make this see a ton of play. In Standard, it saw play in traditional aggro decks like Stompy and Mono Black, but a creature like this isn't just good in creature-heavy decks. It also saw play in Wildfire Control and Mono Blue Control decks. It also saw play in the artifact-heavy Tinker deck, where in conjunction with Metalworker, it wasn't hard to make a ton of mana and wipe your opponent's board with the Masticore's first activated ability. At Worlds in 2000, where Standard was the format, 6 of the top 8 decks ran Masticore, a pretty good indication of its power in those days. It saw play in a wide variety of extended decks too, including that format's version of Tinker, as well as in various red, black, and blue-green aggro decks. It had some dominant showings there too, including 4 of the top 8 at Pro Tour New Orleans in 2003. With all the creature power creep these days, Masticore isn't seeing play anywhere, and hasn't since 2005, but it does have a pretty impressive legacy. At number 9, we have the first of 3 artifacts on the list involving Phyrexian mana, which should come as no surprise because Phyrexian mana is busted, and that first one is Vault Scourge. Essentially a 1-mana 1/1 with flying and lifelink, the Scourge gets a big boost out of being an artifact creature and has primarily seen play in artifact-heavy decks that have ways to pump him, at which point the lifelink can make it impossible for your opponent to race you. In Block and Standard, it saw play in Tempered Steel decks, which ran an enchantment that gave all artifact creatures in your deck +2/+2. Since it was printed, it has been a fixture in modern affinity decks, where putting +1/+1 counters on it from an Arcbound Ravager or equipping it with Cranial Plating makes it huge and makes it impossible for your opponent to race you when combined with lifelink. It is continuing to see play in affinity decks, so it seems unlikely that it will stop putting up points anytime soon. Although the recent move towards artifact decks that run hardened scales and focus more on +1/+1 counters may mean it sees a little bit less play if affinity is being played a little less. At number 8, we have another card with Phyrexian mana. This one is a clone, and it's Phyrexian Metamorph. A 3-mana clone that can be played without any colored mana and has the ability to copy more than just creatures. That's what makes Phyrexian mana so busted, is that any deck can play a card like this, even if it's technically blue. As a result of being able to see play in basically any deck, it has seen play in multiple formats. In Standard, this included Delver, Cawblade, Red-Green Aggro, Zombie decks, and Birthing Pod decks. In Modern, it also saw play in Birthing Pod, but also Jund and Eldrazi. It's even seen play in Legacy, where it can be additional copies of Lords in your Merfolk decks, as well as in Zoo and Control decks. Vintage is where it is seeing the most play right now, showing up in Mud, Eldrazi Aggro, and Ravager shops. At number 7, we have what is the oldest card on the list, though it has received several reprints making it modern legal, and that's Ornithopter. The card on its own is actually kind of bad and not really worth a card. It basically does nothing. For that reason, it never really saw play on its first several printings. But if you can combine Ornithopter with artifact synergies and actually make it worth a card, then you're in business. Basically, every deck it has seen play in can do this in one way or another. Once Mirrored in Block and Affinity was born, it started seeing a lot of play. In Block, Standard, Extended, and Modern, it saw play in various Affinity builds, all of which ran both Cranial Plating and Arcbound Ravager, enabling you to make the Thopter huge without a whole lot of effort. It has done the most damage in Modern by a wide margin, with 63 points in that format alone. On a more recent trip through Standard, people combined it with Ensoul Artifact, which enabled you to attack with a 5/5 flyer on turn 2, and if your opponent didn't have an answer quickly, they were just dead. Ornithopter is going to continue to put up points as long as Affinity is a relevant deck in Modern. At number 6, we have an artifact creature that doesn't like it when your opponents cast non-artifact spells, and that is Aethersworn Canonist. She makes life hard for any deck that isn't casting primarily artifact spells because she only lets them play one spell a turn. That, combined with the decent Grizzly Bear stats she has, makes her a pretty nice card. Though it was completely unplayed in block and only managed one Grand Prix top 8 when she was in Standard, she has found a home in most other formats. In Extended, she appeared in Affinity decks, since the effect was largely one-sided, as well as in sideboards of other decks. She has seen play in Modern too, showing up in sideboards of artifact-centric decks that make the effect one-sided, and it's an effect that's quite powerful against a multitude of decks in the format, including mini combo decks. She has also appeared in Birthing Pod decks, and she actually found herself in the main board of Birthing Pod decks, since they're capable of searching up toolbox hate creatures like Aethersworn Canonist. However, Legacy is the place where the Canonist has flourished the most. In a format that has a prominent Hate Bear style deck called Death and Taxes, she is one of the many hate creatures that the deck plays, and she of course also shows up in lots of sideboards, such as in Blue-White Miracles and Stoneblade. At number 5, we have an artifact creature who also leaves artifact creatures behind when it dies, and that's Hangarback Walker. Hangarback Walker is super powerful for several reasons. First, it's flexible. Sometimes the right thing to do is just play it for 2 mana as a 1/1, and from there, you can pay a single mana a turn to slowly pump it. Second, it replaces itself when it dies, making a Thopter token for each +1/+1 counter on it. The last part can be pretty insane, as the Walker can effectively just sit on the table and gain counters until it's big enough to attack or block, and if it dies, you suddenly have a flying army. Hangarback Walker saw a lot of play in Standard since it was basically always insane card advantage, and like many cards on this list, it doesn't cost any colored mana, meaning you could play it in a lot of places. So in Standard, this included artifact-heavy decks like Blue-Red and Soul Artifact alongside Ornithopter, but for a while there, it was seeing play in just about everything. Jeskai midrange, Selesnya aggro, Blue-Green control, Mono-Green ramp, and near the end of its time in Standard, Green-White tokens. It was just a staple for much of its time in Standard because the card had no real board state where it was bad. In Modern, it has found its way into Tron decks, who can quickly cast this huge, and in the more recent +1/+1 counter heavy hardened scale affinity decks. And in Vintage, it has also seen play in Ravager Shops decks, along with several other cards on this list. It synergizes really well with both Steel Overseer and Arcbound Ravager, since both can put counters on the Walker. At number 4, we have a card that is so powerful it was banned from both its block and Standard formats, and the card I'm willing to bet most of you thought would be number 1, and that is Arcbound Ravager. I've mentioned this card a lot when talking about other cards in this list, and that's a pretty good indicator of just how powerful it is. It sees play in every format where an artifact-heavy deck has been viable. The Ravager gets its power from the fact that it can suddenly represent lethal out of nowhere, especially if you've dumped your whole hand of artifacts on the field. The modular mechanic makes it really problematic, as it can sacrifice itself and move the counters to something else, like Ornithopter or Vault Scourge. This makes it a nightmare to try to play removal spells against. Either you have to deal with a huge Ravager or the creature they put the counters on, so you usually need 2 removal spells to be in the clear. When you get multiple Ravagers in play, things get even sillier. While it got banned pretty quickly in both block and Standard because it was just way too powerful, and this stifled its ability to put up any serious points there, it has more than made up for that in other formats. Affinity is perhaps the only deck that has existed since the beginning of Modern that has managed to remain Tier 1 since the format was created back in 2011, and as a result the Ravager, one of the more important cards in the deck, has put up insane finishes there. More recently, the Hardened Scales version of the deck has made it so the Ravager does lethal even more easily, but it also does pretty well in Vintage, where it shows up in Ravager Shops decks, which do their best to power out a ton of artifacts on turn 1 or 2, produce a bunch of extra mana with Mishra's Workshop, and overwhelm the opponent with creatures like the Ravager. It is going to continue to amass points, and it is a card that has stood the test of time, so I think it's likely to continue to climb up this list. At number 3, we have an artifact creature that refuses to stay in the graveyard, and that's Scrap Heap Scrounger, which only recently rotated out of Standard, where it was one of the most ubiquitous cards around, since you could easily play it off of a black splash. Early on during its time in Standard, it found its way into decks that could take advantage of the artifact type, like various vehicle decks, but it also saw play in a multitude of aggro decks that were running at least a little black. For example, Winding Constrictor, Red-Black aggro, Mardu aggro, Jund Energy decks, Mono-Black Zombies, and basically just all the decks in the format. Basically, any creature-based deck with black in it was running this. And this is what allowed it to amass 117 points in Standard alone. But it doesn't seem super likely that it will be able to keep up with Ravager and non-rotating formats going forward, so it's probably going to lose this spot in the next year or 2. At number 2, we have another creature who likes Arcbound Ravager's +1/+1 counters, and that's Walking Ballista, who can turn each of those counters into 1 damage. The fact it can do this at instant speed makes it really hard to ever kill this thing in a way that it doesn't blast you in the face first or kill one of your creatures. It saw a ton of play in Standard, where the fact it was colorless and super powerful meant, like a lot of the cards on this list, that a wide variety of decks played it. Just to name a few of the most successful decks to run the Ballista, there was Golgari Constrictor, which was focused on +1/+1 counters and can make this get big even more quickly. There was also the eponymous Mardu mid-range deck called Mardu Ballista. It also saw play in a wide variety of vehicles and energy decks. Unlike the Scrounger, who doesn't seem to have a bright future in non-rotating formats, Walking Ballista has already proven itself powerful enough to see play in them. In Modern, it's seen play in Tron decks that can quickly power it out as a large creature very quickly, as well as in the +1/+1 countered focused version of Artifact decks that run Hardened Scale and the Ravager alongside the Ballista. In Legacy, it has seen play in Death and Taxes, as well as Eldrazi Aggro. It even sees play in Vintage, where it shows up primarily in Ravager shops, where that combination of Arcbound Ravager and Walking Ballista is a real pain. Walking Ballista has had a pretty absurd 2018, gaining 39 points in the year so far. While it has rotated out of Standard now and the rate of play will go down a little, it has a very real shot at maybe someday being the #1 card on this list. At number 1, we have a card that has come in at number 1 on 3 other lists too, and there's not a card that's even come close to doing that, and that is Spellskite. Spellskite has what has to be one of the most obnoxious activated abilities in Magic history. It can redirect the targets of spells or abilities, and, thanks to the abomination that is phyrexian mana, it doesn't even cost any mana to do it. As a result, Spellskite is a great sideboard card in decks that want to protect their combos, but also a good sideboard card against combo decks that are planning on targeting their creatures or players one way or another. Spellskite is just incredibly flexible, and it can get in the way of the plans of lots of decks. It's a card that has seen play in just about every kind of deck sideboards, and obviously it is good at making removal not hit your best creatures, but we're going to talk about the various matchups where Spellskite was really frustrating for people. In both Standard and Modern, Spellskite was a great way of combating Splinter Twin combo decks. If it was in play, your opponent had to find a way to kill the Spellskite so they could combo off, otherwise the Splinter Twin would end up targeting Spellskite. Splinter Twin has since been banned out of Modern, and Spellskite has seen less play there, but there are still other decks it's good against. One of these is Infect, which is a deck that has been relevant in Standard, Modern, and Legacy at various times, and Spellskite was with it in all of those formats. Infect decks like to play a ton of combat tricks and kill you quickly. If Spellskite is in play, all those combat tricks are going to be targeting Spellskite instead. It's especially potent against Infect decks too, because your life deck basically doesn't matter against them, and you can use this activated ability all the way down to 1 life if you want to. Overall, Modern is where it has been played the most. This is in part because Splinter Twin was legal there for a long time, but it's great against a wide variety of Modern decks that are still around in addition to Infect. This includes Bogles, where it can hijack auras, Burn decks, where you can just redirect the damage from burn spells to Spellskite, which is especially frustrating if that damage is less than 4, and it will be a lot of the time. It can also redirect Scapeshift decks, Valakut triggers. It's also decent against Affinity, where you can use it to redirect +1/+1 counters from Arcbound Ravager, and against Kiki Core decks, which are essentially the descendant of Splinter Twin. Basically, Spellskite is the kind of card you should probably have 1 to 2 of in just about any deck in Modern, and that's why it has put up so many points. It continues to be relevant in Modern, and that's not going to change anytime soon. Well, that does it for this week's MTG Top 10. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future MTG Top 10s, like the one next week over First Strike, don't forget to subscribe and click the bell icon so you can get notified of new videos.